Outside of being asked, why aren't you married and why don't you have children, the next most common question that I get is, if you are Ukrainian, why do you speak Russian?
So if you're from Africa, why are you white?
Oh my God, Karen, you can't just ask people why they're white.
And since I am back now here to Kiev, the city that I was born in, I thought that this would actually be the perfect time to answer this question, because I understand, it is a little bit strange, saying you're from one country but speaking a different language, but I'm sure many people can relate that in certain countries, multiple languages can be spoken, especially during very, tumultuous historic times. Obviously, in the last 10 years, with many of the events, that have happened between Ukraine and Russia, most Ukrainians, I would say, choose to speak Ukrainian over Russian. But basically, anybody my age or older, more than likely also knows Russian. But let's take a couple steps back, because technically, in my particular story, we are also talking about the tail end of the Soviet Union. I was born in February of 1991, and the final kind of dissolution of the Soviet Union happened in December of 1991. And in that time, even though there were, of course, the different countries, the different republics, as they were known as, Ukraine being one of them, of course, they had their own cultural identity, they had their own language. But of course, you have to understand that it was under the umbrella of, Russian power, Russian sovereignty, where Russian language was very much pushed as the official language. So basically, every single country that was in the Soviet Union, all of them, had to learn Russian. So that's why if you travel to other, post-republics that are still somewhat close to Russia, like let's say Kazakhstan or Armenia, you will find that a lot of the people in those countries, as well as speaking their local language, they also will know Russian. So since I was born at the tail end of that, and also because my family, specifically my mom, my biological father, and all the family that I have living here, they all were born in Russia but moved here kind of in their early adolescence. Like my mom was 14 when they got to Kiev, so even though she's technically spent more time in Ukraine than she has in Russia, but that was where she first grew up. So obviously at home we spoke primarily Russian, and during the Soviet Union, and I would say the next at least 5 to 10 years after, it was still absolutely normal to predominantly speak Russian, at least here in Kiev. You have to understand that in Ukraine there is some divide between different regions of the country, where it's understandable that the eastern regions, the closer they are to Russia, the more likely that language is going to be spoken more there, whereas in the west of Ukraine, you will very rarely ever hear Russian, and Ukrainian will be dominantly spoken. During the Soviet Union, as far as I was told, here in Kiev, Russian was primarily spoken, like same as it was in Odessa and in Kharkiv. In those major cities, it was still widely spoken. But obviously, once the Soviet Union broke up, once Ukraine chose to, really step into its independence, and it wanted to get closer to the European Union and really embrace its own cultural identity, then things really started moving over to Ukrainian. And as you'll, hear for yourself when you come here, Ukrainian is now very dominantly spoken here in Kiev. But going back to my particular situation, obviously, right after the Soviet Union, Russian was still widely spoken. And since I moved to Canada when I was 5 years old, with my stepdad, who's from Canada, I never went to school here. So I never got into the school system. I never learned Ukrainian for that reason. And obviously, with all the trips that me and my mom did back to Ukraine to visit from Canada, we were mainly just coming to Kiev. I mainly only talked with my family and, my friends who are perfectly comfortable speaking in Russian. So I never really felt, the need to learn Ukrainian. So I would say that I am very much an anomaly because I moved to Canada so early. I think any Ukrainians that were at least a little bit into the school system, they would have, began learning Ukrainian, or if they spoke Ukrainian at home, obviously that's a different story. Ethnically speaking, I am very much a mix, and I actually did, a DNA test. Some of you guys may remember where it literally told me that, you are Eastern European. I didn't tell you exact countries, but it highlighted the region, which was primarily Ukraine and Russia, and actually a little bit into the Baltic states. So, ethnically, DNA speaking, I am very much a mix of both, but just because of the political time that I was born in, where, Russian was the sort of dominant language in my particular situation, and I was never in a position to really have to use Ukrainian, I just never learned it. I think it was probably around 2010 when I really did notice things changing a lot here in Ukraine for many different reasons, but specifically with the language, with everything that happened with Russia occupying Crimea and then the full-scale invasion in 2022, it's understandable that most Ukrainians don't really want to speak Russian anymore. They want to embrace their own national identity, which was stifled by Russia for a very long time. So I'm absolutely in complete support of Ukraine embracing its national identity, for Ukrainian to be the dominant language. But of course, in my particular outlier case, my case is definitely not the norm. It does make things a little bit challenging. For anybody wondering if it is taboo to speak, Russian right now here in Kiev, it's absolutely not. Like, I have actually been quite surprised of how much I have heard it. Like, I would say it'd be around like maybe 80-20, something like that. Like 80% of the language that I hear outside is Ukrainian, 20% is Russian. And so far I haven't faced any sort of stigma in, speaking Russian. But what tends to happen is that the people, especially in working any sort of businesses, they will reply back to me in Ukrainian because, that is kind of what's expected by any sort of businesses and organizations nowadays, because they assume that I understand it. Like, it's actually very common that you will hear conversations of one person speaking Russian, the other one speaking Ukrainian, and they do understand each other. It's fine. But obviously in my particular case, like, am I going to tell them my whole life story of why I don't speak Ukrainian and all of that? No. So I have been trying my best to really, learn Ukrainian as much as possible, even if it is just, from listening to it, because obviously to speak, I'm nowhere even close to being able to do that. But I have actually been surprised how much more I understand of Ukrainian than I originally thought. I haven't been here for basically the last 4 years, so somehow I had it in my head that my listening skills of Ukrainian were going to be similar to what I've experienced living in Bulgaria, of like maybe 15-20%. With both languages, if it's written out, I can actually understand a lot more. But when it comes to the speaking portions, it really goes down because of the pronunciation. But so far, like I said, with Ukrainian, I think I probably do understand maybe like 30 to 40% when people are speaking to me. So it's actually, better than I expected. So any sort of simple interactions, let's say like going to the cafe or even in a restaurant, like I can usually get by, speaking Russian and then replying in Ukrainian. But if, let's say, it was a more complicated situation, like, I don't know, let's say going to the doctor or something like that, I would actually try and rely more on English, because thankfully English, especially here in Kiev, is beginning to be more widely spoken, because that way I would feel I could get my point across and obviously understand the other person more fully. But yeah, for those wondering, like, is it okay to speak Russian in Kiev? It definitely is, but it's just that more than likely you will be replied back to in Ukrainian under the assumption that you also understand. in the west of the country, it might be a different story. Like, I haven't been to Lviv since, before the war. And even when I was there before the war, I did get a few not so pleasant looks when I would speak in Russian. So, of course, when I'm visiting the more western part of Ukraine, I will generally just speak English. I find that is just easier. But basically, the other big centers like Kiev, Odessa, Kharkiv, like, you will be fine speaking Russian. But speaking directly to ethnic identity, because I will get the question a lot, like, are you Ukrainian then? Or are you Russian? Or are you Canadian? Since I've technically spent the majority of my life in Canada, obviously it's complicated. But beginning with Ukraine, I mean, obviously I was born here. I had a Ukrainian passport as a child, and between Russia and Ukraine, I have by far spent far more time in Ukraine, since I spent more or less the first 5 years of my life here, and then we would come back to visit family usually 1 to 2 months at a time during like my summer breaks. And when I got to be an adult, I would also come stay here for a month or two at a time with my family. So all things considered, I have probably spent, 8 years, here in the country, primarily in Kiev, of course. Whereas with Russia, like, I don't have any sort of, documentation of ever being registered there, as well as the fact that I have literally only spent maybe 4-5 months altogether, in Russia. And the majority of that was the 2019 trip, Trans-Siberian trip that I did through the country. I was only there, I think, 2 other times when I was a kid, to visit, some relatives that we have living in St. Petersburg. So the maximum amount of time that I have ever spent in Russia was like 5 months. I have spent far more time in Ukraine, have the actual documentation of being a citizen here. It's actually very exciting, where in January of 2026, they are going to make it, legal for Ukrainians to have dual citizenship. So that is when I will be willing to take a Ukrainian passport. So I'll have Ukrainian and Canadian citizenship. So I guess if I had to choose one over the other, Ukrainian over Russian, obviously I would consider myself more Ukrainian, than Russian. But still, on top of that, because I don't speak the language, and because compared to Canada, I have not spent that much time here, I haven't gone through, the school system here. I don't fully know the Ukrainian history and culture, as much as I would say I know Canadian history and culture. I would actually consider myself Canadian above both Ukrainian and Russian. And I don't know if any of you in the comments can relate, anybody who has, moved around to many different countries, which one you feel closest to for many different reasons. But for me, it really comes down to the fact that I came to Canada at a fairly young age. I think I integrated very easily and very well. I learned English, as my dominant language. I'm much more fluent in English than I am in Russian. Like, funny enough, I actually almost forgot Russian. I remember when I was in my early adolescence, because after my grandmother passed away, I just wasn't calling back home quite as much. And, with my mom, just when I would see her, we would speak a little bit in Russian, but I would still primarily speak, in English. So there was a period where I literally felt myself forgetting, Russian, and I didn't want that to happen. And I did make a genuine effort to try and utilize it more. I started watching some, Russian-speaking YouTubers, Sonia Esman, if any of you guys were a fan of her. She was like my favorite Russian-speaking YouTuber, because she also lived in Toronto at the time. So it kind of, felt close to my situation, where those kinds of things really helped me remember Russian again. And now I would say my Russian is, of course, fluent, but it's not at all the level of a local. Like, I do sound pretty funny saying certain kind of things, and the more advanced sort of vocabulary I don't really have because I don't really, use it in those kinds of terms. So while my Russian is very good, it is nowheres as fluent as my English is. And technically right now the Canadian passport is, the only nationality that I legally hold. So when people ask me like what ethnicity, what citizenship are you, of course I would say Canadian. Now, the next very common question that I get is, am I ever going to learn Ukrainian? Is that something that I want to do? Short answer is yes. Like, of course, I would love to know Ukrainian, but I mean, if we're being honest, it's not that simple. Like, it's not that easy to just learn, a second, third, fourth language. And since I just moved to Bulgaria and struggling enough with that right now, learning Ukrainian on top of that doesn't really make sense. Like, it's not really something that I need, since I don't see myself spending probably more than, a month every year coming here to visit my family. But if I actually moved here, then absolutely, then it would make sense and I would definitely make the effort. But for the time being, when I speak with, my family, my friends in Russian, like, obviously they do not judge me for speaking Russian, in this particular time, I don't really see the need to do that. In the future, if I was spending a lot more time here, then definitely I would try my best. As you guys know, I'm very much on the bandwagon that everybody should just learn English as a secondary language, like as an international language. Like, I don't even care if it was English, but I just believe that the whole world should decide, they should just decide on one secondary language for everybody so we can all understand each other better. Because it's a bit ridiculous to expect that in every single country that you go to, especially with the amount that people travel nowadays, that you're going to learn everybody's language and everybody's just going to know 50 different languages. Like, it's not going to happen. So the next best thing is, yes, preserve your cultural identity, have your particular national language in every country, but choose another international language that everybody can speak, that everybody can understand, and then, we don't have all these unnecessary sort of complexities. But that's just my opinion. We're all entitled to our own opinions. So let me know your guys' thoughts in the comments. And I hope this video kind of explained, my particular situation, because it is rare. Like I said, most Ukrainians nowadays will primarily speak Ukrainian, and anybody my age or older, especially if they grew up more in the central to eastern part of the country, will also know Russian, but it is, a personal choice whether they choose to speak it. So I hope that cleared things up. I am very much proud to, be a Ukrainian since I was born here, but at the same time, yes, like, I do have Russian heritage, as in what my parents grew up in, and the culture at the time was very much dominated by Russia more than it was Ukraine. So of course, historically speaking and culturally speaking, I know more music and movies and just traditions that maybe would be considered more Russian than they are Ukrainian because of the family that I grew up in. So of course I also have very strong ties to Russia. But at the end of the day, I am very much Canadian. I very much grew up in Saskatchewan, spent most of my adult years in Toronto. So if you asked me, what do you identify as? I identify as Canadian. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And as always, I am sending you so much love. Keep being your own kind of beautiful. Bye, guys.